Climate policies have consequences. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and I'd like to have just a little kitchen table chat with you about a new report that I've read through called Blueprint for More and Better Housing. As you know, the federal government is trying to implement new policies to increase the housing stock in Canada and to increase the affordability of it. So that sounds good and it sounds necessary, but what does it really mean? Part of the blueprint is the idea that just like after World War II, when between 1946 and about 1960, the federal government facilitated the building of about 1 million houses in Canada, victory houses as they were known, or strawberry box houses. They now want to build 5.8 million homes that are affordable, low carbon, and resilient, and to do that in about the next 8 years. Something like that. I think what's alarming about it is that the top recommendation for the federal government and for provincial and municipal governments is that they should tie all federal infrastructure, transit, and housing funding to provincial and municipal adoption of pro-density legalization reforms, including eliminating unit maximums on all forms of residential housing, abolishing parking minimums on residential, commercial, and industrial properties, legalizing the construction of CMHC pre-approved housing designs as of right, and ambitious as of right density permissions near transit. So I'd like just to talk about that today and what that means. Now, you know, when our soldiers came back from war, there were about 120,000 that had been trained right here in Alberta, mostly in the British Air Commonwealth training plan. And in fact, in Alberta and the prairies, I should say, it was known as the aerodrome of democracy. That's how important Canada's contribution was. So of course, all of the men and women, mostly men, who came home from war, you know, had fought for freedom, and everyone felt they deserved a home, a good home. So, you know, plots of land were set out, and you must understand, in Canada there had already been quite a lot of prepackaged homes that were sold, even by Sears and Eaton's. You could order them, and anyone with a hammer could put them together. But of course, those were simpler times. So, and we had all these men coming back from war. Many of them were in very good shape and looking for work, so we had a workforce as well. So, you know, we set up these little houses on a little piece of property, and over time people planted their garden, and it grew into a nice little neighborhood. And people felt at home, and peace had arrived. So now, what this legislation means to me is that if density regulations are removed and due process is removed at the municipal level, and municipalities are more or less coerced into agreeing to that, otherwise they won't get federal funding for things that taxpayers actually have paid for, I think we're going to have something like this. We're going to have some people who need and want cash to build on their property beside the little strawberry house, maybe a fourplex. You know what, maybe that wouldn't be a bad idea. but some people will want to build an 8-plex. So that changes the character of the neighborhood quite a bit, doesn't it? Some people might have the money, or maybe there's a small company or a group of people who put money together so that they can build an even bigger multi-family dwelling in what used to be a quiet little neighborhood. So, you know, that might happen without typical due process, where people can come and say, you know what, I don't want to have a big condo tower in my backyard. Or if you're going to build that condo tower, then I want you as the developer to build us a park out in the middle of the lane. So you can see how this would have a very serious character-changing effect on a neighborhood. And yes, this is going to be much more affordable housing because it's hooking into existing infrastructure. But part of the plan in the blueprint is that anything that's built new should be built for the newer standards, meaning that these will be all electrified, so there wouldn't be gas hookups for cooking. So that means that this whole neighborhood would have to have all of its electrical upgraded significantly. And imagine no parking or no parking minimums for the street. So now this person who's lived here for 40, 50, 70 years, or their family even longer, now what they used to have for street parking for when friends or family came over vanishes, and whatever parking is left, it's a battle between all these newcomers, some of whom will have cars and some of whom won't. So you can see it's also a kind of, and I hate to use this word, but it is a kind of subversive way to get people to use transit. In fact, in one policy options paper, they recommended that the federal government actually acquire the land alongside transit corridors in cities, acquire the land. So I don't know if that means buy it, expropriate it, or what, and build there to improve the density, and then people will be using mass public transit, which many people know that since COVID, transit ridership is way, way down, because people are realizing, hey, if it's a contagious disease, maybe I don't want to be on the train with everyone when it's virulent. And now, since that's happened, a lot of people became homeless due to the COVID crisis, and some of them are now more or less living on the trains, making it unpleasant and sometimes dangerous for people. So the other thing that they're suggesting here is that by doing this kind of building, climate resilient building, like climate resilience appears in here more than homelessness does, if you can imagine. What they're suggesting is that they will reduce the carbon footprint of housing. So, for instance, they're really basically trying to phase out single-family home construction. They say here that the business as usual scenario in which there continues to be limited provincial implementation of the 2020 National Building Code, or a second scenario where provinces move to Tier 3 of that code, and a third scenario in which the conditions of the second scenario complemented with the electrification of all new buildings as of 2025, that's just a year away, finds that the business as usual scenario, meaning single family homes and conventional construction, produces 12.9 megatons in annual GHG emissions in 2030, whereas the more ambitious actions to cut these emissions by 4.2 megatons while reducing household spending by approximately 5 billion per year. That's what they're assuming, that electrifying all of this and doing this kind of multifamily construction would save. But somebody's got to pay for that new electrification infrastructure on the street. Someone will have to pay probably for sewage upgrades, because what used to serve this little house probably won't serve this many people and this many people. So it looks like a real chaotic mess. And they're saying here that the current, in the scenario where the all-new housing is single-family detached homes built in greenfield areas using current GHG intensive construction methods, 94.2 megatons of annual GHG emissions are generated in 2030. In the scenario where all new housing is in multi-unit buildings built within existing urban boundaries, there's only 8.0 megatons in 2030 as a result of the embodied emissions, a savings of 86.2 megatons per year. Now, just so you know, China puts out in 1 month what Canada puts out in a year and 8 months in terms of GHG emissions, meaning that these savings will be outpaced probably within a day by China's expansion and by those of other developing nations. So why are we doing this? We're doing this because the federal government is stuck on the idea that RCP 8.5 is the climate catastrophe scenario that we're facing, when in fact RCP 8.5 is an implausible scenario. It requires that all the coal on Earth would be burned, that there would be double the oil production and use by 2100, and that there would be 6 billion more people on the planet than even the UN projects by 2100. So it's an implausible scenario, but Infrastructure Canada uses RCP 8.5 as the quote-unquote business as usual scenario for all infrastructure financing for cities. So that may be why your city has declared a climate emergency, so that they can align with that and cash in on that money. But there's really no need for it. And as I've just explained to you, there's no benefit. And in fact, there will be an awful lot of urban chaos. So I think the Helter Skelter plan for housing should be put on hold, and maybe some simpler options explored, like facilitating boarding rooms and boarding houses. And perhaps we should stop the Century Initiative, which is bringing in 1.5 million or more people every year, for which there are no houses. And maybe we should repeal the Net 2030 and the Net 2050 laws that the Government of Canada implemented. Because you see, the Paris Agreement is purely voluntary. There's no requirement to meet any target under the Paris Agreement. It's the Canadian federal government that turned that into a law for itself, and it can repeal it anytime it wants. And if it did that, that would solve a lot of problems for Canadians. So I'll be doing more of these little conversations at my kitchen table. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.